You know, sometimes the most powerful storm isn't the one you see on the weather map. It's the one that blows up online right after. That's exactly what happened when a devastating hurricane hit Jamaica. A totally different kind of storm erupted on social media, a really fierce, viral conflict between some Jamaicans and foundational Black Americans. Today, we're going to dissect the anatomy of that digital war based on our source material.
Okay, so let's just dive right in. How did an event that you'd think would bring people together actually end up driving a wedge between communities? Specifically between some Jamaicans and foundational Black Americans, and that's a term for the descendants of enslaved Black people here in the United States. That's the big question we're unpacking today, and the theory our source presents goes way deeper than just a couple of angry videos.
The reaction online was wow, immediate and incredibly intense. This quote, which we pulled from our source, really captures the raw anger that a lot of Jamaicans were throwing at tourists who were stuck on the island during the crisis. It was a very clear us versus them vibe.
And this quote kind of shows you the other side of that coin, this specific complaint. The perception was that certain tourists, and specifically Black American tourists, were acting entitled. They were complaining about resort services while locals were literally dealing with a national emergency.
So, the first piece of this whole puzzle is what we're calling the storm of accusations. A massive hurricane hits, but the online conversation wasn't just about the damage, it was about this heated conflict, with accusations just flying back and forth.
This slide really breaks down what people were so mad about. The main complaint was that tourists were just being insensitive, totally failing to read the room. You had videos going viral of people complaining about things like getting their food served in bags during a Category 5 hurricane, and that whole story quickly got wrapped up in this viral term, entitled Black Americans.
And that brings us right to the core of this whole online battle. Entitlement versus emergency. The entire argument was framed as this massive clash between what tourists expect on vacation and the brutal reality of a national crisis.
But get this, here's a really crucial point from our source material. All of this outrage, this huge digital firestorm that swept across social media, was apparently sparked by just one or two videos from tourists complaining at a resort. The reaction just seemed totally out of proportion to what actually started it. And this is where our source throws in the first major plot twist. It asks a pretty simple question. Was all that anger even aimed at the right people in the first place?
See, the whole firestorm was running on one key assumption, that the people in those viral videos were foundational Black Americans. That basically became the accepted fact that fueled thousands and thousands of angry posts and response videos.
But according to our source, that entire assumption was just wrong. The host claims the identity of the tourists at the very center of this whole thing was mistaken from the jump.
This slide lays out the source's counterclaim perfectly. The analysis says the women in the videos were actually from Bermuda, which would make them fellow Caribbeans. Now, if that's true, it means that this massive wave of anger aimed at foundational Black Americans was based on a complete and total misidentification.
But here's where the analysis goes a whole lot deeper. The source argues that the fact that everyone was so quick to blame one specific group, even if it was a mistake, shows that the anger wasn't really about the videos at all. The hurricane was just the trigger for something else that was already there.
So let's really unpack this core idea. The central theory here is that this wasn't some spontaneous reaction to a couple of annoying tourist videos. Nope. It was an opportunity, an excuse to basically unleash what the source calls a pre-existing cultural resentment that's been simmering for years.
So, to explain this resentment, the source presents a pretty controversial historical theory. It contrasts what it calls two totally different historical experiences within the Black diaspora. On one side, you have foundational Black Americans, described as having a spirit born from a legacy of rebellion and direct confrontation. And on the other side, it characterizes some Caribbean and African experiences as being shaped more by quiet endurance and a colonial mindset, basically a way of thinking inherited from their history with outside colonial powers.
And digging a little deeper into that, the source argues that foundational Black Americans developed what it calls a different spiritual energy. The idea is, because their resistance was internal, happening right inside the belly of the beast, it created a unique culture of having zero tolerance for disrespect.
Okay, so you might be asking, how does this complex historical theory connect back to a modern-day resort in Jamaica? Well, the source argues that these underlying tensions become crystal clear in the dynamic between tourists and the locals who work there.
This slide lays out what the source describes as a kind of psychological chain reaction.
It starts when FBA tourists show up and they visually represent a kind of freedom and wealth that locals, who might be working tough, low-wage jobs on their own land, feel they don't have. This stark contrast, the theory goes, creates this underlying hostility.
And the source powerfully sums up the internal thought process driving this resentment with this really direct quote. It suggests this feeling of, how are they enjoying our homeland in a way that we can't? That question, the analysis suggests, is really at the heart of all this tension.
All right, so we've looked at the event, the claim of mistaken identity, and the deep historical theory that's been presented. Now let's bring it all together for the final analysis. This table does a great job of summing up all the interlocking pieces. According to the source, it's about freedom of movement, the fact that FBA tourists can travel in a way that might trigger envy. It's about how affluent Black Americans challenge old colonial myths about some kind of hierarchy. And finally, it's about the subconscious resistance that can pop up when locals are in service roles for tourists who look just like them.
So the crucial point, the big takeaway from our source material is this. This online war was never really about bad tourist behavior during a storm. The source argues it was an eruption of complex, deeply rooted historical and economic tensions that have been simmering just below the surface for a very, very long time.
And that kind of leaves us with a final, much bigger question to think about. This whole situation suggests that what looks like a simple online argument might just be the tip of the iceberg. It really makes you wonder, when we fight with each other online, what are the unseen histories? What are the deeper resentments that we're really fighting about?